The month of Halloween horror continues. Do you have the right tools to survive? Silver bullets, holy water, Fido keys? You'll need to keep yourself safe from zombie bites. You'll need to keep your memory safe from null bites. So as you take your evening stroll through the graveyard, be careful, because some things just aren't ready to rust in peace. Which means this week we talk with Tom Gibson from Cloudsmith about what an SBOM can really tell you and why it's important for your organization. In the news segment, Twitch is haunted by a breach. Apache revives the slasher genre. Microsoft disables a macro cosmic horror, and more. Board up the windows and stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. It's the show to learn the latest tools, techniques, and processes necessary to understand DevOps, application security, and cloud security. Your trusted source for the latest application security news. It's time for Application Security Weekly. Whether you need to manage bots, protect cloud applications at runtime, stop form jacking attacks, or secure your web applications and APIs, only Imperva offers a unified solution to protect from edge to application and data in one tool. Imperva helps you achieve more, save money, and become more efficient with fewer security vendors needed. Start a free trial today to easily protect your apps and website with Imperva. Learn more at securityweekly.com/Imperva. Is your mobile app really secure? New vulnerabilities pop up every day, and malicious actors look for easy targets on app marketplaces to exploit. Securing your app's valuable IP and data is critical. GuardSquare security solutions are built for developers and protect your app at every stage in the development lifecycle. Multiple layers of protection prevent reverse engineering and automatically detect tampering, making your app a difficult target for attackers. Learn more at securityweekly.com/GuardSquare. We discuss application security a lot on this show, and we know that the implications for code security have become even greater as cloud adoption accelerates software development. Shift Left bridges the gap between security teams and developers to find and fix vulnerabilities accurately from the source. Shift Left Core is an innovation in code security with industry-leading accuracy and speed. It combines next-generation static code analysis, intelligent software composition analysis, secrets detection, security insights, and contextual developer security education in one easy-to-use platform. Learn more and create your free account at securityweekly.com/shiftleft.
This is episode 169, recorded October 11th, 2021. I'm your host, Mike Shima, and I'm here, as always, with John Kinsella. Hello, John.
Hey, man. Johnny just faded out our background music. I just started getting into it. Happy Monday.
Happy Monday, John. And John, if you, like any of our listeners, don't want to miss out on your favorite Security Weekly content, you can visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe on any of our podcast feeds and have all new episodes downloaded right to your phone. You can also join our mailing list, Discord server, and follow us on social media and our streaming platforms. And all of the above gives you a chance to bop along to our theme music with John. In other news, Security Weekly Unlocked will be held in person this December 5th through 7th at the Hilton Lake, Buena Vista. We'll have keynotes from Alyssa Miller, John Strand, Leslie Carhart, and Dave Kennedy. Visit securityweekly.com/unlocked to register and check out our exciting lineup. With over 10 years in the worlds of DevOps and FinTech, Tom is currently a senior staff engineer at Cloudsmith, where he helps lead and develop the product and platform. As an automation and security enthusiast, Tom is incredibly passionate about helping people and organizations implement and adopt technologies and processes that help secure their software supply chain. When he's not busy with computers, you can find him watching the latest reality dating TV show, building Legos, or doing his 500th home improvement project. Hello, Tom. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, Mike. Thanks so much for that. Great to be here today. Really looking forward to our discussion.
Well, we're definitely looking forward to a discussion and for you taking time out of those home improvement projects, which I suspect is also reading a lot of, well, maybe there's 500 because you haven't been reading as many instructions perhaps, or trying to make sure you have all the materials, which I think sets us up for a discussion about software bills of materials. And, I kind of alluded to this at the beginning that, they're important. They're part of the supply chain. We've been talking about them, us as well as the industry, ever since, of course, that infamous compromise over December, but they're pretty important. So long rambling intro aside, help us set up a little bit maybe of how we should position the idea of SBOM into the supply chain, and we'll kind of unfold things from there.
Sure, absolutely. Well, I guess we'll take a start. I always like to start this whole thing with a bit of an analogy to the hardware industry, an industry that has gotten this right for a very long time for the most part. And it's the concept of being aware of the content of an application, so the dependencies that make up that application. We're increasingly in a world where applications are decomposed of many different third-party application pieces and segments, as well as internal home-written pieces as well. And it's about maintaining a list of all of those pieces for the purposes of, a variety of reasons, ultimately. For legal folk, you're able to present a list of licensing requirements to assert that you're conforming to legal requirements in certain regions. But predominantly, it's about having assurance that you're safe. Essentially, that your components that you're bringing into your application stack are vetted. They're as free of vulnerabilities as possibly can be, and that they do what they say ultimately. And it's about having that level of certainty. And I mentioned about sort of alluding a little bit to the hardware realm of that, and the concept is not new for there. If I don't have it with me right now, but if I was to show, a phone, an iPhone, an Android phone, whatever it happens to be, the components of that device are made up of a bunch of different things. I don't know them all, but you can be sure that the manufacturer does. They'll have an approved list of vendors, so sources that sources that pieces of the actual product can come from, as well as who are trusted to actually provide them and ultimately what go into the end product as a whole. And so SBOM is kind of like applying those sorts of concepts, but to the software world. And there's been, as you've previously sort of mentioned here, Mike, there has most certainly been an emphasis on this as a piece of importance, certainly in recent times with the various attacks that we've seen recently, SolarWinds being a great example of something that probably kicked off a whole initiative. It's not new, but I think it's been revitalized, and we're starting to see renewed efforts across the board from various organizations that are really trying to strengthen on the bill of materials and the software side.
Indeed. And to me, it falls into that category of just improving visibility, observability of just what software are we deploying into prod? What are we consuming? And you really highlighted that in the aspect of that, in the sense that SBOM is just telling us what's in the tin, what are we using? And I think, and I know you weren't making this point, and one of the things I want to get in front of too is that SBOM doesn't magically protect us from 0 days. It's not that type of preventative measure, but what it does enable us to say, when a vulnerability is identified, a vulnerability is announced, we can say, is this going to affect us? And hopefully we can go back and point to this package, this other package are what we need to now go and immediately update, rather than scratching our head, hoping we have some other long-winded way of trying to find, are we exposed to this? So that's where I want to pull in some of the vulnerability scanning, perhaps, or maybe just the vulnerability handling aspect of this, because one is the known vulns, but SBOM is, I think, also about provenance and a bit of quality assurance. So how do these different factors play into what perhaps an SBOM can represent for an organization, and help us have that confidence in the software that we're using?
Sure. Well, a great point to start talking about provenance. It's you're right. It's a key part of the whole concept and philosophy of SBOM. And I should say, with regards to SBOM, there are different versions of this in terms of the specification. We've got Cyclone DX being one, SPDX. They're all ultimately trying to solve similar goals and similar ambitions, but the provenance side of things for that is ultimately about having a trace of what has gotten brought into the system and by whom. So it kind of extends to having assurance about the integrity of the components, and trusting that it is what it says it is, that it comes from where it claims to have come, and it was written by who claims to have written it. There's some really, really interesting stuff happening in the provenance side of things at the moment. To call out names perhaps, but there's a very interesting project known as SigStore. It's backed by Google. A couple of other players like Red Hat are interested in this as well. And their approach to this has been ultimately that we have gotten to a point where our commercial software that we're building on a day-to-day basis relies increasingly upon untrusted, for the lack of a better phrase, open source components. And it opens up the exposure to various, bad actors within the system that can inflict harm through various ways. Introduction of vulnerabilities, and then obviously, actually acting upon them is another thing. So SigStore is a great example of something that's trying to combat that. And it's ultimately about creating a chain of trust between the author of a piece of code of open source, and then verifying that, once it gets the whole way through to an image, for example, that it is exactly what it was when it set out, and it's written by the same person. So the provenance trail ultimately describes that. And, for us in Cloudsmith, for example, we try to facilitate that through a whole bunch of different ways. But we're talking about the concept of what we would say continuous packaging. And continuous packaging for us is essentially applying that whole concept of SBOM right the way through, from a developer writing code, pushing some code up to a Git repository, more than likely, and then kicking off a build process as a result of that. And the provenance trail for us, we feel, should effectively start from right at the beginning of that train and work right the way through to the end. And it's about having a catalog of events and being able to essentially trace an artifact that's come out at the south side that's been published perhaps to a customer or an internal system, and be able to piece together everything that happened in order to actually determine how it got there and by which actors were affecting it as well. So,
go ahead.
No, sorry, I was going to turn it around a little bit then in terms of, you'd mentioned about vulnerabilities and talking a little bit about that as well. And for us, we would see vulnerability. Obviously, vulnerabilities are an interesting one, because it starts to get into the discussion about what is acceptable risk in software. And it's tricky, because there will always, or will very much likely to be, vulnerabilities in almost every application that gets built today. Again, talking back to the bill of materials philosophy and how things are componentized into different pieces, and those can be individually exploited over time. And there's some very good and interesting ways in which people have tried to solve this. For example, the Cvss scoring system tries to put like a metric around. And I mean, most of your audience will 100% have understood this already, but for the 1% perhaps that are new to this, it's a great baseline to begin with, but it's obviously not the bread and butter. It can't be 100% relied upon. I think it depends on a fair bit of due diligence and understanding of the systems. It kind of acts as a factor, I would say, in terms of determining the risk factor of a vulnerability, but it shouldn't be the actual gospel. And
no, indeed, and I think you're getting to those points too. The CVSS does have those temporal environmental factors that can influence the score, but to build that type of context and understand how this score should adjust to the business context of the app, takes a little bit. It takes time to do, and that time is pretty. It is a scarce resource, both from the developer's perspective to say, well, how do we prioritize this? How many of these vulns do we really need to fix because they will be exploitable, versus how many can we not bother with, or how many can we accept for now and then put off and address at a later point. On the same vein, so with vulnerabilities, we're kind of talking about a bit of reactionary aspect. We build our catalog of software, we have our SBOMs that give us an idea of what we have, and then when a vuln gets announced or we identify one, we go out and fix it. But I'm curious, what are some additional ways that perhaps you've seen organizations be able to have some more proactive controls about protecting the dependencies that they're relying on? And here I'm starting to think about perhaps some of this aspect of provenance, things, attacks like typo squatting, things like that, or even just being able to say, how do we figure out, should we use a package in the first place, or which packages would be acceptable in the first place, setting aside even the presence of vulnerabilities?
Yeah, it's a great point. Certainly when it comes to 0 days at that stage, I'm not going to say game over, but you're in a very precarious situation at that point. And we as people within this industry should be doing everything that we can to help mitigate that from happening. And I mean, we've got a variety of tools out there to help facilitate that. The drum has been beaten on this show, and in many others, about shift left security, for a very long time, but for a very good reason. It's the right approach. It's about having that split of tooling for developers in the early stages of code being written, to understand the impact and the factors, and perhaps to have sort of procedures around even simple things like bringing in dependencies in the first place. Do we really need this particular dependency? What is my exposure by bringing this in? And I think the SBOM approach helps to inform that decision, but it is ultimately still a decision that needs to be made by organizations and development teams. But by utilizing tooling, I think across the whole spectrum, I don't think there's a silver bullet per se, but we have at our disposal, more tools than ever before. And SigStore is a good example of one I've just mentioned that helps sort of reduce the uncertainty in terms of open source components. But it isn't enough in isolation, I don't think. And I think we're probably, as engineers, going to have to start to think from security from the outset. It's not necessarily that we're going to completely deprecate security teams. I don't think that's ever going to happen. The concept of bringing security into the concept of engineering, it's a strong one, but it's time consuming, and as you've just mentioned, there's this nature of being proactive about it and having reporting, and it's probably not something that's going to fall within a developer's day to day. But use of SCA tooling, for example, in order to actually ascertain that what's being written in house is less likely to introduce something, that's a start. Having assurances of where your application dependencies come from, that's obviously another super critical thing. To tie this back even to tooling, like for example, in Cloudsmith, we have a concept of bringing in upstream proxying, as we would call it. So allowing you to bring in your third-party dependencies. And you touched a little bit on sort of name squatting and typo squatting. And ultimately, that's the kind of thing that this aims to mitigate, in that, you have all of your client tooling pointing to the one source of truth, as it were. You've got your entire provenance trail going from start to finish throughout this one sort of single pane of glass. Again, not with the marketing words, but I think it actually sort of applies to this concept. But and in that case, if you're utilizing upstream proxying, for example, it's capable of going off to third-party repositories and doing the verification side of things, bringing things in, caching those dependencies and making them available as the list of the SBOM then for that particular application. And when we do this, I think it's probably a fairly good idea to even think about how these things can be structured, because ultimately we can. Historically, you've had like a Docker registry and perhaps a Maven repository and maybe a Python. Organizations use a whole host of different tools, and once you even start to get to the infrastructure side of things, it gets even more complicated because you have very similar processes that need to happen on the infrastructure side of things to try and avoid attacks. Great example would be Sentinel by HashiCorp that integrates with Terraform Cloud. It's a fantastic tool. help you put policies in place to, perhaps avoid doing things like having unopened or wide open VPCs, for example. So I don't think to tie this all back, I don't think there's one size fits all solution here. But it's about being aware of everything from start to finish across that whole build and deploy pipeline, and being aware of the tooling and the strategies behind it to help us influence the design and development of those processes and ensure that things are better ultimately.
Indeed. And I think one of the aspects too that you're coming back to mention quite a lot is the tooling, even while acknowledging that these are processes. But in order to make those processes successful and in order to make them scale, you need to have the tool in them. And just that idea of like an upstream proxy is insane. Rather than having an AppSec person, throw an intern, say, you are now the approval person, and you have to look at every single, package dependency that's being pulled in and has to give it a thumbs up, thumbs down to approve. That's just honestly silly, because you'll burn someone out. It's not interesting work, but it's necessary work, and it's something that lends itself to automation. And it's very similar to the concept like in prod of blocking egress traffic. You don't want images to randomly initiate connections outbound unless you already know and understand what that destination is going to be. In this case, same thing with that type of proxy. Route the dependency manager or dependency checking through some centralized point that makes it easier to scale and inspect. So that's why, to me, it sounds like a successful path towards making this type of security possible, while still having maybe a presence of an AppSec team, but giving them more interesting things to work on, so they don't just necessarily have to go away. I'm curious too, then, on the aspect of some of the packages, or rephrase it this way, you were touching on a lot of different tools, a lot of different aspects of the CI/CD pipeline. So if we do talk about some perhaps aspect of an approval process, and it could be an automated approval or it could be manual approval, what are some ways that you've seen DevOps teams and AppSec teams deploy this successfully, and mistakes perhaps that they've avoided, or mistakes perhaps more importantly for our listeners that they've learned from to figure out this is the healthy, constructive way to do such approval versus the way that's going to burn everybody out and not really get us where we want to be in terms of secure software? Sure.
No, that's a good point. If we tie things back a little bit, even to talk about the concept of proxying upstream, I think one of the issues that you really have whenever it comes to think about things like name squatting is the fear that that someone, and this is obviously a very well worded topic. It's out there on the web. Check it out. Google it if you've not come across it before. But utilizing an upstream proxy alone will help mitigate that. It's as simple as, and you're absolutely right. You 100% will still need AppSec teams. That's not going to change overnight. The tooling is getting better, but in terms of actually sort of talking about automating improvement or automating roll-ins of let's give vulnerabilities, for example, it's probably not an overnight thing. I would say we're probably still going to need some kind of manual intervention on that. It's interesting because from a personal perspective, the concept of automating security scares me a little bit. And then there's obviously different levels of this as to where it can, what's okay and what's not. I mean, if we were to talk about vulnerabilities and whether or not something affects it, there's obviously a point at which we have to look at something in isolation and go, well, is this actually in a critical path of code that we actually use? Is it dead code or something along those lines? So the point being that there's a thought process involved in that, and so to do automation on that is quite tricky. And we've seen customers, certainly I've seen customers that have attempted to do it, and it's some with some success, but there's certain edge cases, and you ultimately end up duplicating a lot of the work in order to do it. I think the approval process is still incredibly important across the board. If we think about a great example of how we tend to ask or sort of give advice to our customers to do this would be, take a repository and have it represent an environment. So have like a staging environment, for example. So a whole repository that represents staging, and another repository that represents production. And then we would ultimately talk about the approval process of gating things from A to B as it progresses through the pipeline. And I think possibly utilizing some tooling to prompt people to do investigations on things is probably super critical and super important. And again, it varies, right? Application dependencies, we could go the whole way through and start talking about things like Dependabot and alternatives, things like that. People have in practice, merged those sorts of things into code, and providing that the acceptance tests pass, that's probably okay. But I think I guess what I'm trying to say is it's probably quite context sensitive, depending on the nature of what it is that you're trying to change. Essentially, if it's a small upstream dependency that's being brought in, and you're capable of engineering your processes in such a manner that you're able to perform succinct end-to-end testing, for example, prior to the promotion into production, then that's great. But I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all solution for it, and definitely I think it relies on a fine balance of developers' time and AppSec teams' time as well.
Yeah, it brings up the famous threat modeling phrase that begins, well, it depends. The business context is important. A lot of what we've been talking about, too, is as consumers of an SBOM. We're relying on an SBOM to have been generated so we can use it for many of these decision processes that you've been describing, so that developers AppSec team can have those informed discussions and figure out how we can prioritize, have our different repos represent staging the A to B to C transition, which all of that makes a lot of sense. I want to turn it around, though, in the sense of what about organizations that need to generate SBOMs? Are there different steps? Are there things that you would recommend, whether it's something like choosing Cyclone DX or some other different type of SBOM format, so that they can produce SBOMs for others to be consumed?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think ultimately, like the concept of an SBOM is probably there to provide certainty of makeup and conformance and all that good stuff. You're right. We've talked at length about the consumer of someone that's doing that. As a producer, I think it helps to credentialize more than anything else. We've all within the industry, we've all worked with vendors and partners over the years, and you get endless amounts of security questionnaires. There are security certifications such as ISO 27001 in terms of your process improvements, SOC 2, for example, as well. And they're great and very, very important. And they very much are there in order to have a certain level of certainty about the business processes. I think being able as a producer, being able to produce an SBOM upon request for your product, it's that extra sort of stamp, if you will, that extra seal of approval. It gives assurance to your customers for sure. And in terms of the process, you're right. There's Cyclone DX, there's SPDX. I guess depending on how things have been structured, it should be a relatively painless process. I say should be. It's probably not, but these things ultimately give assurance to everyone across the line. And as a consumer of software, if an organization could present this to me, it gives incredible clarity in terms of the actual effort that business is putting into security. And obviously something that's very, very critical and very important to them. And it just strengthens the perception ultimately as well. But perception stuff aside, as a user of that, it's important. And we talk about SBOMs in terms of software bill of materials, but we could go on in terms of bills of materials. There's talk now of SaaS bombs as well. I'm not sure if you probably have come across this as a concept, but very similar sorts of things. What SaaS products do you use in order to actually produce the product that comes out at the end of your pipeline? And again, that type of information can be useful because it's nice to know that your exposure, if you're relying upon a SaaS, for example, where are the weak points in this application's security infrastructure? Is it within AWS? Are they relying on an independent CDN like Fastly or something? And having that information, it's all just about transparency and provenance and about giving that information out to people. I think irrespective of what end of the spectrum you're on, it's an incredibly useful piece of information, and one I think most of us should really be vying to get essentially from our services.
Yeah, you're basically, pulling what is it, raising the curtain. I'm looking for like a Wizard of Oz perhaps metaphor here, but just showing that there's a lot of complexity behind software being delivered. There are the small bits of here's just a one self-contained NPM package that might have a cascading link of 20 more packages on it, or something that is a more complex, like you were just saying, SaaS, and here's CDNs behind it, here's other providers, here's the other CDNs that were just involved in developing this, and any one of them could have potentially introduced a vulnerability or introduced a weakness. So that's pretty interesting. It's just in the sense of showing we're all basically, maybe it's the idea that AppSec is a team sport, and we're broadening with SBOM the size of the teams, perhaps that we realize are playing this game. And I don't know exactly where I'm going with that, other than building up metaphors. So let's get off the metaphor aspect and to another question, in the sense of you spent quite a bit of time looking at SBOMs. You've given us some great ideas, both as consumers, producers of SBOMs, what they can help with. In other words, how to position them within your threat model or within your processing. Is there something that you would love to see SBOMs also adopt? Because I think we're still in the early days, we're perhaps in the late days of understanding the problem, but probably in the early days of actually getting to a solution. So is there something that still hasn't been pulled into the SBOM umbrella, so to speak, that you would love to see, or something else that how you would love to just see the SBOMs represent information, or just make themselves be easier to be consumed?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think we're starting to get to a defined standard for good or for bad. And, I'm not sure if any of your audience have seen the XKCD comic of standards, 17 standards, there's now, that sort of thing. But yeah. I think standardization is obviously a first step, and we try to come to some sort of consensus over what makes sense. But in terms of the features of what's in those SBOMs, and also, I guess, the usefulness of them, I personally would like to see more adoption in, native tooling, for example, that's used within the various different programming language environments. So if it was capable of generation of SBOM, for example, for within, if I happen to be a .NET developer, perhaps the NuGet client, or Maven, for example, is another one. There are plugins that can do this sort of thing in Maven, but I think it would be fantastic if we could start to see some of this adoption across the whole sort of flow of all the various tool chains that people tend to use day in, day out within, the application and application security world. And it can complement each other and ultimately try and lift some of the burden of that stuff away, and make it almost table stakes, I guess. But the interactions, the integrations of that then, and the usefulness of that information, I think, perhaps being able to take that stuff and present it in some way in terms of observability pipelines. So, the Datadogs of the world, the New Relics, whatever it happens to be in your organization, trying to get that information into a presentable way where you're able to react upon changes for negative, for good or for bad. So if something was brought in that was disallowed, shouldn't happen with the tooling, it is there to prevent it, but just in case, and in terms of reporting and the simplification of all of that stuff. I guess if you look at the specs of these things and get an idea of what it's capable, you're able to talk about things at a component level, and you're able to talk about files, and that's quite good. We were able to talk about licensing. That's great. We were talking about operating system interoperability. There's a whole bunch of stuff there, but I think the spec, you're right in the sense that it's early days, and we're going to see as time evolves, we're going to start to see more of an influence of all of the various stakeholders of the different standards committees that are producing these things. But from a kind of from my own personal standpoint, I would love to see organizations tooling just adopt it so that it is a standard, so that I can put this thing into things and actually see it, that my client tooling, that a developer who's maybe never had to think about this before is capable of just running something on like a Docker command line or something and getting that information out. I think that would be great if we can get to that point in the future.
I think it would be great. And I think just kudos to you for every answer you've managed to bring in an aspect of automation tooling to make things easier. So, and that really speaks to me as someone who not necessarily lazy, but likes to be efficient, so to speak, or slightly less, making the joke. It's just, I think it's going to be a way to make that scalable. So bringing this into the IDEs, bringing this into Golang, for example, or other aspects that are creating sort of these statically compiled aspects, that statically compiled binaries are a lot harder to introspect, to figure out what version of OpenSSL did it pull in. Was it a vulnerable version, not vulnerable version? So I can see there SBOMs that are part of the compiler process can really help us out. So I think that's a great message for you to bring with us, Tom. And I think throughout this whole segment, you've brought us a lot of great messages. And I want to thank you for that.
No, thank you very much. It's a privilege to be here. Very happy to talk. I could talk at lengths about this stuff, as you can probably tell. So, yeah.
Indeed, and we'll definitely have to talk with you more about your background too. And by background, I mean the fabulous amount of Legos that are on those shelves, as well as on the theme of observability. You've got a nice telescope back there as well. So lots of fun things within the application security that I'm sure we could bring in metaphors to SBOM.
Yeah, probably too many.
Probably too many, which probably means we need to let you go for that 501st home improvement project. But thanks again, Tom, for joining us. Thanks, John, as well. For all of you hanging out with us and listening, if you'd like to learn more about Cloudsmith, visit securityweekly.com/Cloudsmith. And with that, we're going to take a quick break and reanimate with news of the week.